If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 31, Divided Vision. 6 months later, after Orion returned from Factorywood. Inside the dimly lit last drop, Vander and Benzo, Vander's longtime friend, shared a drink in an otherwise empty bar. He's taken a liking to the young lad, Benzo shrugged, his pint of ale sloshing around as a faint smile tugged at his lips. The clockwork book from Powder, it came from their old hungry adventure. Benzo chuckled deeply, taking a swig. I guess stupid sometimes does pay off. Ugh, Vander shook his head, gaze cast down at his drink. I thought that boy would keep them out of trouble. It hasn't helped in the slightest. They're kids, Benzo replied gently. His tone carried a layer of compassion, his gaze steady and understanding. You can't stop them from getting into trouble. But you made the right call, placing Orion with them. From what I hear, he's bailed them out of a fair few sticky situations. Taking a drink of his own, Vander sighed, that he has. Pausing for the moment, however, Vander hesitated before weighing his words, speaking slowly. Something's off, with the boy. He's getting help elsewhere outside of Topside. Creak creak. The sound of the bar doors opening interrupted their conversation. Vander and Benzo turned, freezing in disbelief. Vander's mug slipped from his hand, crashing against the counter and spilling out across the counter. Benzo slowly rose from his seat, eyes narrowing. Vander started but was cut off by Benzo's deep growl. Silco! What are you doing here? Benzo bellowed. The grip on his pint tightening, poised to hurl it across the room. Silco's presence cast a long, menacing shadow across the bar, the crimson glow of his corrupted eye slowly shifting between them. Can't I visit? Silco's low voice resonated through the bar, hands wide in an exaggerated gesture, though his hollow gaze betrayed his mockery. We were once comrades in arms, after all. Glass shattered beside Silco's head as Benzo hurled his pint across the room. Silco didn't flinch, his expression remaining cold and unfazed. Still have your temper, I see, Silco remarked, his tone dripping with mocking disdain. I should gut yo, Benzo snarled, stepping forward ready to charge Silco. Benzo. Benzo stopped as he felt a firm hand on his shoulder. It gave him enough of a moment to pause, glancing back with restrained fury at Vander, who had stepped out from behind the bar. Why are you here? Vander rumbled, his sharp gaze locked onto Silco. For the briefest moment, something flickered across Vander's face, softness, regret, perhaps even unease. But as quickly as it appeared it vanished, replaced by hardened resolve. A momentary pause occurred in the tension, their eyes locked through vile and contempt. Without a word, Silco's hand drifted into his tailored suit, causing Benzo and Vander to tense further. Smirking, he pulled out a dusty parchment between two fingers. Your pup's parents went missing because you were obsessed with finding me, Silco said with measured amusement, his voice cutting through the tension. So, I decided to search myself as payment to the boy for assisting with our vision for Zon. He let his words sink in, his satisfied gaze flicking between their faces, drinking in their dawning realization. Silco's good eye shifted downward to the letter, his gaze softening. He held it softly in both hands as if it were something precious. That's when I found an old letter. The past is between us, Vander said, his voice tinged with remorse yet firm. His eyes still wide with disbelief and shock. Why did you involve the boy? Silco's smirk widened, his narrowing crimson eye returning to Vander. Orion, now there is an interesting boy. Stepping forward, his voice carried amusement and contempt. Working topside, taking care of your little orphans, and yet, he paused for a moment. Lending me his talents for Zon. Vander's expression darkened, voice lowering to a growl. He's not yours, Silco. A loud mocking chuckle echoed through the bar, Silco's mocking voice following. Oh, I don't own him. No one does. Orion serves himself like any smart person would down here. The boy learned a lesson that you refused to accept pragmatism over idealism for a better future. For Zon. Benzo's angry voice spat out beside Vander, his demeanor barely restrained. He's just fighting for survival. You're twisting the boy's choices to fulfill your agendas. What's wrong with survival? Silco shot back, his voice sharp and cutting. He plays all sides because he understands the way the world works. Dancing with the topside ears for scraps, babysitting your kids, helping build the nation of Zon. That isn't loyalty, Benzo. But it is admirable. You're just using him, Vander growled, his words laced with fury as he clenched his fists. I'm giving him the tools to survive. Silco retorted coolly. Orion sees Zon for what it could be, not for what you wish it was. And don't worry, old friend. He knows better than to trust anyone. Not me, not topside. Silco's crimson eye gleamed, leaning in slightly. And certainly not you. Vander flinched, his eyes softening as he hesitated for a moment before speaking in a low voice. I've never forgiven myself for what I did to you. You were like a brother to me. When Felicia died, I lost my head. But your path, Vander's voice gained strength, his gaze sharpening as he stood taller. It's not the way. Was her death not enough for you? You were willing to sacrifice half of the Undercity for this nation of yours. Vander stepped forward with his own conviction rising. What about their lives, Silco? Felicia's kids? Are you willing to risk everything everyone's lives for this dream of yours? Crunch. It was a dream we all shared. Silco roared with rage, crumpling the paper in his fury. Your weakness spat in the faces of everyone who died, making their sacrifices meaningless. Including Felicia's. Hurling the letter to the ground in a crumpled heap, Silco stepped forward, now inside Vander's personal space as he seated. Their faces were inches apart. Vander's beast-like fury was on full display after Felicia's name was mentioned. You act as if I didn't care for her. We shared drinks together, we had the same vision. Silco spat. He glared up at Vander, his voice hoarse with emotion as spittle continued to fly out. And now you sit here, playing lapdog with her killers, meeting with the sheriff in secret. Letting Orion walk topside. I wonder how Six and Powder would feel if they found out. Vander took a steadying breath to calm himself, refusing to take the bait. His gaze lowered to the crumpled paper, his tone calm and measured. I'm doing what is necessary to keep the people of the Undercity of Zon safe. His gaze returns to Silco with a disgusted scowl. I'm not proud of every decision I've made, but we both know Zon wouldn't survive another war. Leaning over without a care for Silco, he picked up his crumpled letter. I want a future for Six and Powder where they don't need to pick up weapons just to survive. The same goes for Orion, and if that means working with Grayson, then that's what I will do. Vander shoved the letter back into Silco's chest, whose fury was yet to subside, and continued, Felicia wouldn't have wanted us like this. Nor would she approve of you tearing everything apart and calling it progress. Silco's expression darkened at Vander's words, grabbing the crumpled paper from his chest with restrained fury. For a long moment, they both said nothing, with Silco's hands shakily holding the paper before sighing. He closed his eyes briefly before opening them, his gaze landing coldly on Vander and with fresh resolve. You were always good at pretending to be the better man. Silco said, his voice low and brimming with disdain. Let me tell you what Felicia would think. She wouldn't want her daughters groveling under Piltover's boots or their father groveling to keep them safe and fed. Safe? Silco mocked, turning around toward the exit, both Vander and Benzo's gazes following him. You think any of this is safe? It's cowardice, Vander. Nothing more. Taking slow, deliberate steps toward the door, he added, don't worry. When the world comes crashing down around you and it will, I'll be there to pick up the pieces. Just like always. Reaching the exit, Silco paused, his hand rested on the frame. Without looking back, he spoke in a soft, but cold voice. And as for Orion? You're lucky he follows you now. But mark my words, when he sees you for what you've become, chasing hollow ideals, he'll leave you. Just like I did. We'll see. Vander's reply was firm, resolute. The two held each other's gazes, sharing a moment of disdain for each other. Neither spoke again, with Silco slipping out of the last drop and leaving it with a heavy tension. What are we going to do? Benzo asked, his voice low but urgent as he looked to Vander. Vander's fists were clenched tightly, his gaze downcast in deep thought. After a heavy pause, he exhaled and turned to Benzo. We need to talk with Orion. Set things straight. Chapter 32, Fractured Ties. During that morning, north of Piltover lay the Frost-Tip Mountain, smaller in size before the Great Barrier Mountain range just beyond. Vastly uncharted and untamed, this natural barrier separated Piltover from the great powers of Nakuz, which claimed dominance over the Great Barrier. Every year, honorary students from minor colleges and the Piltover Academy attend a retreat at the Frost-Tip Mountain. Jace and Caitlin had just returned from the hiking expedition, having split off before first light to arrive home early. Jace babbled on about an important breakthrough he was about to make, and Caitlin was eager to freshen up for training with Orion and Grayson. She had a skip in her step after escaping from Jace's ramblings about his soon-to-be-recognized achievements. Caitlin shifted her bag as she turned the corner, her steps slowing to a halt. Worry enveloped her expression and she started sprinting. The Kiraman Manor had multiple enforcers standing outside with Grayson at the center, all looking grim. One of the enforcers clearly said something as Grayson tilted her head before turning to face Caitlin. "Caitlin." Sheriff Grayson started comfortingly. "What is going on?" Caitlin cut in, her tone sharp with urgency. Grayson paused, her mouth hanging slightly with hesitance. "Tell me." Caitlin demanded, taking a step closer. "Your home was robbed last night," Grayson stated slowly with remorse. Caitlin froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Robbed?" she repeated, her voice trembling, but Grayson pressed on. "Your mother and father are missing too. The servants were found tied up in the storage room." Caitlin staggered back, her chest heaving and tears beginning to form. Grayson grimaced but continued. "The criminals hid their faces, but traces of chemtech were found. We can reasonably assume they originated from the Undercity." Just beyond the gates, Caitlin could see the servants comforting each other. Some were bruised and injured, others were crying. Her fists clenched, and she asked with an undertone of anger and accusation, "So why aren't you there then?" Grayson met her gaze and replied sympathetically but firmly. "Procedures must be followed. Enforcers are locking down the Undercity as we speak. After we finalize testimonies here, we'll organize search and rescue parties." "That'll take too long," Caitlin shouted in outraged, her voice cracking with emotion. "Search parties should already be out." "The Undercity is dangerous," Caitlin Grayson sighed, replying sympathetically. "Sending unprepared and ill-informed enforcers into the Undercity's depths is only asking for trouble." Their conversation was interrupted as an enforcer sprinted up, breathless. "Sheriff." He saluted sharply while breathing heavily. "We've received a tip-off from the bridge. 2 topsiders were spotted being smuggled into the cultivar, located in the Entresol district." Caitlin's eyes widened with hope, but Grayson frowned. "From whom?" "An Undercity resident. He's being questioned but, well, he's difficult to understand," the enforcer reported, his tone brisk as he continued to catch his breath. "He claims to have drank all night and saw 2 individuals in fancy clothing, sacks over their heads, being carried by heavy-set individuals into the cultivar." "Awfully convenient," Grayson continued to frown, skepticism written all over her face. "But it is the only lead we have. Let me come. I can help." Caitlin stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. Grayson shook her head immediately, but Caitlin pressed on. "They're my parents. You've seen me train, I'm a good shot." "I can't risk that," Grayson replied, eyes soft but her tone remaining resolute. "You may be the last survivor of the Kiramans. As the sheriff, I won't risk your safety no matter how good a shot you are." "What was the point of all that training then?" Caitlin cried, her voice broken as tears streamed down her face. "Why go through all the effort if I can't save my family? If my parents died like this, do you honestly think I would care for the council?" Upon the Caitlin's last words, Grayson stiffened. Her face contorted into a deep frown and Caitlin caught the shift. Caitlin paused, tears still on her cheeks as she felt a realization. "That's what you care about, isn't it?" Caitlin choked out, her voice trembling with accusation. Grayson responded quickly by taking a step forward, her tone tinged with agitation upon the accusation. "It's very much the opposite. Cassandra is one of the few in Piltover who truly supported the Undercity, who kept hostilities from spiraling out of control." "You've put me in a difficult spot, Caitlin," Grayson confessed, her voice weary and gaze softening again. "Without a Kiraman, the fragile peace we've fought for will crumble." After a moment of hesitation, she finishes firmly, meeting Caitlin's gaze. "I will go down there personally. You may accompany me, but you will not participate." Meanwhile, Orion was unaware of the events transpiring, having just woken and headed toward the cultivar after receiving a message from C. The streets were a little less busy with the early morning hustle, he noticed, but didn't give it much further thought. Every city has its down days, after all, and it wasn't that surprising for the Undercity. The cultivar was just like Count May's menagerie and the facto Rywood location he had visited, but it was solely a botanical garden. Many Undercity residents would visit it to breathe fresh air, the rarest and most desirable kind. Eerily, however, just like the rest of the Undercity today, there were no crowds or wandering people. Walking closer, he saw the same two large men from Factorywood guarding the entrance. They nodded to him, opening the door for his entry. Orion felt uneasy, they seemed tense, something about their demeanor seemed tense, almost as if they were anticipating something. Adjusting his jacket after passing them, he shifted his gun and last chem flash. That's the first time I've seen them like that. Something's happening. Orion thought, his nerves beginning to flare. Just like Factorywood, the clean air and nature pleasant aroma deceptively masked the dangerous aura of the Undercity as well as the scene before him. Scattered across the botanical garden, including two more by the entrance, were over a dozen gangsters and thugs. These weren't like the kind found in alleys, they were more professional with augmentations powered by chemtech weapons and an undeniable battle-hardened grit. Orion paused as their gazes landed upon him, the room in a tense silence. His jaw tightened as he wondered if he could make it out alive if anything broke out. Clap. 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 Welcome, Orion. Orion fully expected Silco to make an appearance after such a theatrical introduction, but his breath hitched in surprise upon recognizing C's serpent-like voice instead. His gaze shifted further back, beyond the thugs, to see C standing behind two individuals tied to chairs with sacks over their heads. Their clothes were dirted and smudged, but Orion could make out the distinct separations of royal blue and gold. Orion's stomach sank as realization set in. C wore a sly smirk, her eyes dancing with dangerous cunning as her fingers played with the cloth of one of the sacks. "It's time for our little seed to make its decision," she said smoothly, her words dripping with venom. Chapter 33, The Serpent's Garden. "Where's Silco?" Orion demanded, his gaze shifting over what he could only assume were the kiraman house heads. There's no way he was ready for this. "Oh." C purred, her fingernails tracing the edges of the cloth sack, her eyes dancing mischievously. With a sudden movement, she grabbed the head underneath and a heavy muffled grunt emitted. Orion grimaced, guessing it to be Tobias. Whether he is conscious or not was another question. "What miraculous gift gives you the foresight to know if or when he's ready?" C asked mockingly. "This reckless act, without thinking of the consequences, it isn't him," Orion trailed off, his brows furrowing in thought. Slowly, his gaze lifted to meet C. "So what are you doing?" C laughed playfully, releasing Tobias's head and rotating to Cassandra instead, rolling her head in circles like a doll. "What a clever little flower," she cooed, her eyes flashing with amusement through her venomous delight. "You're right, he wouldn't do something like this. Silco prefers his quiet games in the shadows. But more recently..." Her smirk widened. "He's visited an old friend. No thanks to you. Vander." "Indeed. Isn't that a good thing?" Orion asked, confused. "Hardly," C replied with disgust. She rolled her eyes and shoved Cassandra's head forward, eliciting a pained grunt. "You think speaking to the man who threw away so many lives is a good thing? I warned the fool, yet he chose to ignore me." C's voice shifted to mocking somberness as her gaze cast upward to the cracked glass ceiling above. Her hands betrayed her false calm, clawing violently at the air. "But that's also Silco, isn't it? He will sacrifice everyone and pretend it's all for the future for Zon. But in truth, we are tools for the moment." Her gaze slid back down to Orion, her tone returning to its snake-like quality. "Silco views you as a tool. Piltover will never accept you. And Vander? He is both a traitor and a coward." Around Orion, he heard grunts of approval as the mood shifted with the thugs stirring. One slammed his weapon into the floor with a snarl. Her words were riling them up, their bodies itching and ready for a fight. Gritting his teeth, Orion felt an irritation creep into his thoughts. He clenched his fists, his voice low but sharp as he asked, "Your actions don't make sense. Wasn't it Silco who gave you a second chance?" C's voice continued to curl like a serpent around her words. "Oh, Orion. Silco didn't give me a second chance, he made me a useful pawn. Second chances usually come with a leash." She gave a soft chuckle at the end, her fingers back to playing with the sacks. Her eyes darted up to Orion, starting to lose their patience. "Do you think you're any different? Do you think he will view you as anything but another tool to discard when your usefulness is over?" C's smirk fades with a newly formed cold, hard stare. Her hand outstretches to Orion, her tone no longer purring or twisting her words. "I'm offering you more than that. You've seen how Silco thinks, how he uses people. Join me, Orion. Together, we can ensure Zon rises and bring Piltover to heel for trampling on our people. Before Orion could respond, muffled shouts and clattering of boots echoed from outside. They're here, one thug said, his voice thick with eager anticipation. The thugs exchanged knowing smirks and excited glances, their hands moving to unholster the dangling chem masks at their waists. Excitement rippled through them, their movements deliberate as they prepared for a fight. C glanced toward the sound, her voice dropping with a sharp, commanding edge. Decide quickly, little flower. Because if you're with them. A malicious smile grew as she raised her own chem mask to her face, an ominous tone cutting through the muffled mask. Then you'll leave with them. Orion's anger flared as realization hit him. This was your plan? Corner yourselves to fight enforcers. He snapped, his voice filled with disbelief. Waving his hand furiously, he shouts, "Are you stupid? Stupid? This is calculated, Orion." C's voice was razor-sharp even through the chem mask as she glared at him. Her voice rose, addressing not just Orion but the thugs around her as well. This isn't a corner, it's a trap. When Piltover bleeds, they will remember the name Corina Vareza and those who fought for Zon. She's no different, Orion thought bitterly, his jaw tightening as fury and frustration bubbled beneath the surface. His fists clenched at his side, his gaze briefly flicking to the ground, thoughts racing, before returning to Corina with steeled resolve. Orion extended a hand, drawing a gleeful look and a smile visible through the chem mask as she tossed him a spare. Good choice, my flower. Corina cooed with satisfaction. Around them, the thugs let out brief cheers before one yanked a lever. The room plunged into darkness, and the thugs faded into the botanical garden. Orion held his breath as a hissing sound filled the air. It became thick with an unknown pollen while making it difficult to see. Orion exhaled slowly, forcing himself to step back into the shadows. I need to escape, or deal with her here, he thought grimly, his hands trembling as the impeding fight sent adrenaline surging through him. Time to dance. Chapter 34, Outside the cultivar. A dozen enforcers encircled the cultivar, their rifles raised as two heavy-set thugs lay pinned to the ground, cursing furiously. More enforcers stood ready at the main entrance with smaller teams at both side entrances. The cultivar had no rear entrance. It wasn't exactly a normal freestanding building but tucked away amongst a series of tightly packed buildings, blending into the metallic works of the Undercity. Amid the shouts of the thugs, the deafening slams of sledgehammers against the hinges echoed as enforcers worked to break through. Caitlin and Grayson stood a distance away, just inside the encirclement with two more enforcers standing guard nearby. Both women held rifles, though Grayson appeared visibly relaxed compared to Caitlin, who clutched her rifle close to her chest with both hands, her body tense and hunched. Caitlin flinched as the doors broke away from their hinges, rattling loudly against the floor. Grayson's gaze hardened but she said nothing, merely nodding to the enforcers waiting for the signal. Aggressive, muffled commands echoed out. The enforcers surged forward, their boots pounding against the pavement before fading into the darkened building. Unsettling silence followed. Caitlin held her breath, her mask fogging slightly through her exhalations. The silence was stretched unbearably thin until shattered by gunfire, screams, and the sounds of a vicious battle. The enforcers surrounding the building turned in alarm when the gunshots rang out, raising their rifles with expectation for combat. Caitlin's head whipped up as the glass ceiling of the cultivar shattered, a thick cloud of pollen puffing out into the air before settling like a toxic mist around the building, obscuring vision. Get to cover, Caitlin! Grayson shouted, shoving her back as stray bullets whistled through the air, one past her ear. Caitlin stumbled before regaining her footing, retreating to a nearby building for shelter with one of the guards close behind. Her hands trembled as she tightly gripped the rifle, her eyes fixated on the unfolding chaos. The enforcer beside her scanned the area, his stance protective and alert. You two. Move up. Grayson barked commands through the chaos, pointing at two enforcers from each side and motioning them forward. At her command, teams sprinted forward, taking cover at the entrances and peering cautiously into the darkened hallways, their guns raised and fingers on the trigger. Gesturing at two more closest to her, she sprinted as fast as her older body would allow toward the entrance with them. Caitlin could see her momentarily raising her rifle, her world starting freeze before Grayson lowered it. Sidestepping, Grayson's eyes widened with horror as two bloodied enforcers struggled out with one supporting the other with a limp leg. Caitlin couldn't hear her words but watched as she and one of the enforcers disappeared inside. Sucking in air, Caitlin's eyes darted apprehensively across the chaotic scene. The sounds of gunfire and fighting faded shortly after Grayson entered, but her emotions were a blur. She watched in shock as more pairs of wounded enforcers made their way out. Her eyes flicked up to the shattered glass ceiling, catching a flicker of motion. The pollen had already fallen, leaving the view relatively clear from a distance. "No." Caitlin whispered in disbelief, her voice shaking. While faint, she spotted the unmistakable flapping of a familiar iconic jacket, gusts of wind catching it. Raising her rifle instinctively, her stomach dropped, breath catching in her throat. She peered through the optics that gave her a clear view but flinched away, praying it was an illusion. Hesitating, she glanced through the optics again. It was Orion, bloodied and visibly battered. He'd fought. Why is he here? Caitlin's head was spinning and her heart stinging with sharp needles piercing it. Hearing shouts, Caitlin pulled away and turned, watching as Grayson walked out with 2 enforcers accompanying her and her parents. Outside of bruising and some cuts, they were fine. Relief flooded her immediately, but the weight on her chest remained as her thoughts drifted back to Orion. We had the building surrounded. Caitlin's thoughts churned slowly, tears forming as needles of betrayal prickled her heart. That means... Caitlin stepped out and began walking back toward the scene with her guard, catching their attention. She was fully expecting the typical reprimands and disapproval from her parents, her gaze cast downward in anticipation, though also because of her previous thoughts. Instead, Cassandra and Tobias rushed toward Caitlin. Cassandra pulled her into a tight hug, with Tobias wrapping around them both. Unable to hold back, but speaking in a much softer, caring tone, Cassandra whispered emotionally, "You shouldn't be here." Caitlin clutched at her mother's dirty clothes, her acknowledgement subtle as tears fell down her face. She cried softly between sobs, "I didn't want to lose you, I had to be here." After a bittersweet moment of tears and relief, the family broke apart. Caitlin's gaze drifted to the enforcers beginning to drag out dead comrades and foes alike. It was a short, intense battle, to say the least. Was anyone familiar there? Caitlin turned and asked hesitantly, her voice faltering as she looked to Grayson. Grayson, dividing her attention between the enforcers and kiramans, briskly shook her head as she juggled both worlds. No. Should there have been? Grayson's gaze lingered on Caitlin, who froze under its weight in the current situation. Caitlin's eyes dropped to the ground, her mind in turmoil again, but she shook her head and said in a low, strained voice, "No. I suppose not." Chapter 35, Orion's Descent. Footsteps thundered into the botanical garden as the enforcers swarmed in and spread out from 3 directions with weapons raised. As the first few entered, flares illuminated the luscious greenery with an ominous red haze from the pollen. Orion held his breath behind a bush, praying their goggles wouldn't help them see through the dense fog of pollen as easily as the usual undercity smog. Within a split second of thinking that, Orion watched a thug burst forth from the foliage, howling with rage as his blade tore an enforcer's leg clean off. The enforcer collapsed, screaming and dropping his weapon in agony. The thug raised his blade to finish him but was struck down with a shot to the chest, collapsing with a gurgling cry. The battle erupted into chaos. Blood-curdling screams and shouts filled the air. Enforcers left behind at each entrance picked off several charging thugs, but the pollen's haze turned the fight into a deadly, disorienting mess. Orion infused himself with offensive magic, darting toward the nearest enforcer with enhanced speed. The enforcer, catching the movement, tried to whip his gun around, but Orion's strike connected first, shattering his mask and sending him flying several feet back to the ground. Channeling the magic to his legs, Orion sprinted back into the shadows to evade as several enforcers immediately turned and fired on the bush he just left. Orion glanced back at the man he'd struck, pretty sure he didn't hit him hard enough to kill him. The enforcer was writhing on the ground, coughing and spluttering, clawing at his throat as the pollen visibly clung to him and entered his mask, intensifying his agony. Focusing on speed, Orion sprinted up the side of one of the planted trees and launched himself toward an enforcer guarding a side exit. The glass ceiling shattered above, light refracting off the enforcer's goggles, giving him away as he rotated and fired. The bullet pierced Orion's shoulder, but he gritted through the pain, maintaining his channel as his fist collided with the enforcer's chest. The enforcer gasped, the sound of a chest bone snapping as he slammed against the corner wall jutting out and collapsed. Clutching his shoulder, Orion stifled the desire to shout in pain as he resumed moving. His gaze darted to the kiramans, his angle of movement starting to rotate toward them. Rustle rib. Corina sprang from the shadows, a slender blade ripping up Orion's chest and sending him stumbling backward to the ground. A traitor, just like Vander, she sneered. Her fingers wiped the blood from her blade before lunging again. Orion kicked out desperately, landing squarely in her chest and sending her flying back into a tree. Intense pain shot through Orion's leg however as her blade embedded itself into his thigh, severing his magic channel with equally agonizing sharp pain rippling through his body. Ack! Orion's cry blended into the thick gunfire and screams. Somehow she was already recovering when Orion lifted his head, hands clutching at his wound. Sparks of white dotted his vision through searing pain as he took out his gun, aiming it at her. Corina, coughing and wheezing in pain as she struggled halfway to her feet, returned his gaze too late. Bang! Her blood sprayed across the tree before her body slammed against it again, collapsing lifelessly to the ground. Orion immediately scanned his surroundings, adrenaline barely holding him together as he stashed his weapon. The kiramans were less than 10 meters away as he dragged himself into a nearby bush for cover. Orion wheezed and tried to steady his breath, gripping the short blade sticking out of his thigh before ripping it out with a pained gasp. Blood sprayed, dotting the foliage around as the gunfire in the background became less frequent. Fuck, I need to get out of here. Orion cursed, channeling light green healing magic into his leg. His chest burned, his wounded shoulder hung limp, and his limbs felt shredded from extended use of magic pain amplified by Corina severing his connection. The vents, still hissing and emitting pollen, were starting to quiet. Through the thick haze, Orion spotted a ladder on the innermost wall, away from the fighting. It was now or never as his exhausted figure broke into a weak jog. Orion's legs and arms felt like someone took scissors to them, his muscles screaming in pain. His vision blurred, the haze of pain and fatigue weighing him down. Even so, he forced himself forward, his stumbling jog bringing him closer to the ladder. He couldn't move much faster. His legs, especially his recently wounded one, struggled with sharp, shooting pains. It was closer to fiddlesticks, or an old man with bad joints trying to move. His saving grace was the pollen. While the gunshots had faded, the thick fog still clung to the first 3 meters of the botanical garden, obscuring him from view. The top half of the garden had cleared, blown out with the pressure release. Reaching the rooftop, Orion groaned and hoisted himself up, every act of sheer willpower. Keeping himself as low as possible, he continued to crawl toward the other tightly packed rear buildings. Once far enough from the cultivar, he collapsed fully onto his stomach before glancing back. Fuck, Orion cursed aloud, his heart sinking as he realized his wounds left a blood trail. Clenching his teeth, he climbed back to his feet and resumed taking agonizing half-steps forward. What a fucking day, Orion grumbled bitterly, limping back to his home instead of heading topside. Chapter 30.5, Birthday. Short. During the time skip. Nice, and push off, Orion complimented Six as they practiced. She was polishing her ability to switch between southpaw and orthodox stances after slipping a jab or straight right. Smirking confidently, she danced to the side and threw a fast light hook, popping Orion lightly on the cheek. Got ya! Orion rubbed his cheek and smirked back, brushing it with his shoulder. For a while longer, they playfully sparred without gloves, tapping and hitting each other's guard while staying nimble on their feet. Getting into it, Six started stepping forward more aggressively, her taps hitting slightly harder. Realizing she was starting to get out of hand, he stepped in to meet her, pressing down lightly on her head. All right, all right. All right, my ass, Six responded with agitated playfulness, landing a flurry of light rabbit punches on Orion's stomach until he let go. You win, Orion conceded, wincing and raising his hands in surrender. Immediately, she flicked her hand up, tapping his chin. You bet I did, she said, giggling as Orion lightly shoved her shoulder. What? Wanna go again? She taunted, bouncing lightly on her feet. Maybe later. I've got something for you, Orion replied dismissively, drawing a curious look as she lowered her guard. Her gaze followed him as he walked back to the corner, reaching into his slung jacket and pulling out a wrapped package in murky brown paper. Six took it, her gaze darting between the heavy, paper-wrapped object and Orion. Thank you. She said slowly, completely confused, and squeezing it cautiously. Chuckling, Orion nodded at it. Her doubtful gaze followed his nod back to the present. It's an early present for your birthday since I won't be here. Six's eyes widened before gingerly unwrapping it, holding gently a pair of brass knuckles. She stared at them before her eyes flicked back to Orion, filled with emotion, and stepping in for an emotional hug. Don't kill Milo with it, yet, Orion joked lightly, hugging her back with a gentle smile. Six sniffled, brushing her fingers across the brass knuckles before sliding them on. No promises there, she giggled through some tears. She opened and closed her hands several times, stepping away to throw out punches to test their feel. You just beat the shit out of me. I don't believe those tears, Orion joked flatly. Pointing at the brass knuckles glinting under the lights, he added, I changed my mind, this was a bad idea. Six froze like a statue as if struck by lightning. Her gaze flicked to Orion and immediately he stiffened. Aw shit, he muttered slowly with realization, placing a hand on the rope. Her eyes glinted mischievously. Sorry, what was a bad idea? She asked, her voice playful as she started turning toward him. Nothing. Wait 6. Wait. Orion panicked, jumping the rope as Six broke into action, sprinting toward him. She hopped out after him laughing maniacally, shouting with pure delight, come back. No. Chapter 30.6, Christmas. 0 Originality: all lyrics form One More Sleep Till Christmas, Muppets Christmas Carol. Everyone is huddled around the bar, guests and family alike. Wives and husbands hold their loved ones and kids close. The kids follow along, parents bobbing with the music, as she sings sung by Powder. There's magic in the air this evening. Magic in the air. The world is at her best, you know. When people love and care. The promise of excitement is one the night will keep. After all, there's only one more sleep till Christmas. The world has got a smile today. The world has got a glow. There's no such thing as strangers when a stranger says hello. And everyone is family, we're having so much fun. After all, there's only one more sleep till Christmas. 'Tis the season to be jolly and joyous. With a burst of pleasure, we feel it all right. It's the season when the saints can employ us to spread the news about peace and to keep love alive. Merry Christmas! It's so warm. There's something in the wind today. That's good for everyone. Yes, faith is in our hearts today. We're shining like the sun. And everyone can feel it, the feeling's running deep. After all, there's only one more sleep till Christmas. After all, there's only one more sleep till Christmas Day. Chapter 36, Choices and Consequences. Bang bang bang. Ugh, wait. Orion groaned, stumbling downstairs inside his ember-flit alley home with every fiber of his being aching. Bang bang bang. Who is Orion cursed, quickening his pace. He peered out momentarily before fully opening the door. Vander? Benzo. Orion looked worse for wear. His tired eyes drifted between them as his thoughts swirled through exhaustion. What are they? Right. Orion thought, his grip on the door tightening. He knew he couldn't stop these two behemoths without using magic. Normally, he'd be tossed and played with like paper, and he suspected they thought the same. But did they know of his magic? Maybe, I don't know what Vander knows. Orion mused between the silence and tension. You look worse for wear, Vander commented, examining Orion's haggard appearance. It's only been a few days doing things you shouldn't be. His tone carried a hint of knowing. Fuck, what does he know? Orion groaned internally before sighing and stiffly replying, yeah, rough times. What are you two doing here? Vander shrugged nonchalantly. We just want to talk. Mind letting us in? These streets are dangerous for old bozos like us. We could be mugged. Benzo added, feigning distress, his eyes glinting with amusement. Vander chuckled, glancing back at Benzo, his fat arse couldn't even kick a chemrot nowadays. Hey now, Benzo began to protest, but Orion interrupted with a groan like a hungover drunkard, opening the door fully. Fine. Come in. The two thudded inside, the floor groaning under their weight. Not bad. You've taken care of it, Vander complimented, his gaze scanning the clean living room. Benzo raised a brow, adding, is this cause o' those topside ears? Teaching you to keep it tidy. Orion shuffled to the kitchen, pouring water into a few cups. Nah, it ain't any different than the last drop. Just keeping it clean, he replied as Vander sat on the couch, it groaning under his weight. Got some anger issues, I. Vander commented as his gaze lingered on the knuckle dents in the metallic wall. Orion didn't respond, glancing over his shoulder. They didn't look particularly wary of him, so he concluded at the very least it wasn't urgent. It may be serious still, he thought as he brought the water over. No, boy. You'll kill us, Benzo joked, shooing away the water. Our blood runs on alcohol, give us that and we'll croak. Shrugging, he placed it down on the table. For many in the Undercity, drinking alcohol felt safer than water. There's merit to that, Orion thought mildly, eyeing the faintly tinged water. A no-win situation. His gaze shifted back to Vander and Benzo, the dull throb of his headache fading into the background as the real question hung in the air. So why are you two here? The two tensed slightly, exchanging concerned looks before Vander's gaze fell and Benzo leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. You've been talking to Silco, kid, Benzo said slowly, the accusation sharp and abrupt. Vander's eyes snapped up, his expression unreadable as his sharp gaze rested on Orion. We want to know why. And why you never told us. Orion stiffened up, his posture and gaze freezing as Benzo piled on. We know what you've been up to, kid, running topside gigs, pulling in favors, but why Silco? Why the bloody hell him? Vander raised his hand, silencing Benzo with a simple gesture, his gaze never leaving Orion. It was never intentional, Orion admitted with a heavy sigh. Their sharp, fixed gazes refused to leave him as he continued, after I met Six, a lady calling herself C offered me a gig topside at Count May's menagerie. I took it. Some Ionians crashed the place and caused trouble, but I made connections with the kiraman's connections that may be shattered now. This morning, that was you. Vander's voice cut through the room, his posture straightening as his hands rested on his knees. His eyes glinted dangerously. Benzo's eyes widened at Vander's words, his glare snapping back to Orion. No! Orion exclaimed, shaking his head and waving his hands furiously. That lady C, she kidnapped the kiramans. She was trying to backstab Silco and break my connections topside to force me onto her side. Groaning, Orion leaned back, his gaze shifting toward the ceiling as if searching for clarity. Thanks to her, my relationship with the kiramans may be ruined. And as for Silco. He paused, lowering his gaze back to Vander and Benzo, who were locked in a tense stare. I didn't even know C, or should I say Corina Vareza, was working under him until weeks in. Wow! Benzo glanced back wide-eyed at Vander, his expression incredulous as he commented toward Orion. You landed yourself in every dangerous and shitty pile there is. Vander muttered, nodding in agreement, though his expression darkened as his brows knitted together. But why? Orion flinched slightly under Vander's sharper tone. Why did you continue working for Silco after finding out? Vander pressed, leaning forward as his voice took on a hard edge. And why the hell didn't you tell me? You put Six and Powder in danger by staying quiet. You know how dangerous Silco is. Orion's jaw tightened slightly, frustration creeping into his voice as he spoke in low tones. Do you think I wanted to stay involved? People like Silco and C don't just let you walk away. They won't let you. Running a hand through his hair, Orion's voice wavered, then broke. Maybe I screwed up. But what was I supposed to do? Tell you? If you found out, what would you have done? Run in swinging? Expose Six and Powder in the process? I kept it contained. His voice rose, his composure breaking as tears formed in his eyes. Vander stood up, his gaze hardening despite tears prickling the edges too as he stepped toward. Orion continued to shout emotionally, his voice growing louder and more desperate. I've killed to protect them. I killed Corina to stop it all. Orion's glare burned with fury, but his vision was blurred and his mind cloudy with emotion. You should understand. After all, you tried to drown Silco. Whack. Chapter 37, Threads Unraveling. Whack. Orion stood stunned for a second as Vander's hand clipped him across the head. Emotionally, he was deadlocked between anger and frustration, trying his hardest not to lash out. He knew he'd gone too far, crossed a line. Vander had held back, but the instinctual rage to respond swelled within him. Orion knew how this would end if he let loose with his magic, his body locking up as he struggled for self-control, his hands twitching at his side. For a split second, a dark thought flickered caving in Vander's chest with a single magic-infused punch, but Orion snapped out of it to meet Vander's glare. Why do you think I stopped him? Why do you think I gave it up? Vander growled, standing inside Orion's space as if daring him to try something. Clearly, he underestimates me. The dark thoughts swelled, a burning desire to retaliate resonating in his chest. Grabbing Orion's shoulders, Vander's voice softened, tinged with sympathy. That rage you feel now and when you were forced to kill, it'll eat you alive. It will cost you everything. It happened to me, and Silco's still drowning in it. Vander gave him a rough shake, his tone a mix of aggression and pleading. It's not worth it. You'll lose everything. 6 in powder. The ones you fought for. Vander barked. Benzo chimed in, his voice lighter but pointed, and little man, too. You want me to tell him? His friend snapped and went feral. Magic flared in Orion's arms, shoving Vander's grip away with surprising force. The sheer force of it forced Vander back a step, his expression startled as Orion seethed, fists trembling as he glared up at Vander. Get the fuck off me! Orion spat, frustration clear in his voice. I get it. Do you think I'd throw it all away now? He exhaled sharply, his gaze dropping as his shoulders slumped. I'm just I don't know. Bitter. I've tried so hard to hold it together, but now it's over. Vander nodded, speaking slowly and carefully as he studied Orion. Good. It's better this way. Nothing good comes from Silco. Orion's thoughts churned as memories of the Arcane show flooded his mind. His gaze shifted back and forth across before he let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. Silco winning would mean more chaos, shimmer, and further degeneracy and decay. Silence settled over the room as Orion's heated adrenaline ebbed. He muttered gloomily, I'm going for a walk, before striding past them and slamming the door. Neither spoke at first, only exchanging glances. Finally, Benzo frowned and broke the silence. Why did you let him go? I didn't. Vander said quietly, his gaze dropping to his hands, bewildered. He forced me off. He overpowered you? Benzo asked, disbelief plain in his voice. Vander nodded silently. The two exchanged another glance before Vander muttered, he's still hiding something, but that's enough for now. Benzo furrowed his brows in thought before nodding, best not anger the boy further today. His gaze shifted to the water, chuckling softly. Must be the water. / evening at the Kiraman Manor / Cassandra sighed, her voice heavy with exhaustion. I reported what I could. They struck us unconscious repeatedly, so most of it is a blur except for his voice. I'm certain it was Orion. Orion is no longer welcome here, Cassandra's voice sharpened as continued firmly. The unusual cause of death for their leader and his disappearance suggests he may have helped us. But his presence alone makes him complicit. If word gets out, it could ruin our reputation. That's why he's not on the wanted list. Cassandra and Tobias were marked with bandages and stitches, the room clear of servants. The mood, to say the least, was heavy. Even Caitlin struggled to argue as she shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, though her desire to settle what she had witnessed previously burned intensely. What if I talked to him? Just one meeting. Caitlin protested, trying to inject reason into her voice. We had such a good relationship. No, Caitlin. Tobias interrupted with a firm tone, his unyielding gaze meeting hers. Even if he was forced into the situation, it's far too dangerous now. Despite any good he's done, the fact remains he was with such monsters. Caitlin recoiled slightly as he finished with a disapproving shake of his head. No. We cannot allow it. As much as I hate to admit it, Cassandra added reluctantly, I do feel pity for the boy. You're assuming too much. You only heard his voice. Caitlin shot back defiantly. Tobias countered sharply, rejecting her argument. And what other reason could he have had to be there? Talking with them? He had to have known them. Cassandra stood and sat next to Caitlin, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. I know he meant something to you. Cassandra began softly. He was your age, and one of the few who encouraged your hobby. It's not a hobby. Caitlin snapped, brushing her mother's hand off her shoulder as she stood up abruptly. This whole incident proves why I want to become an enforcer, and you still won't listen to me. I will become an enforcer. Caitlin, it's safer to follow in my footsteps, Cassandra urged, standing as well as she gestured sympathetically. You can influence so much more from a seat on the council. You could grow the enforcers' numbers, give them purpose. It would be helping so many more instead of becoming a grunt. Grunt, Caitlin scoffed bitterly, crossing her arms in disgust. I'm sure Grayson would love to hear that. Grayson is different. Cassandra replied firmly. You wouldn't be Grayson, Caitlin. Not at first. The enforcers' roles are limited, they need something and someone to believe in. Caitlin, you can shape those beliefs. You can be that person. Cassandra tried reaching out for Caitlin's hand but Caitlin stepped back, shaking her head with resolution. You disgust me sometimes, mother. Her voice was sharp with bitterness before she turned to stride out of the room, Cassandra calling after her fruitlessly before sighing in defeat. Tobias stood and hugged Cassandra from behind, comforting her with gentle words. She is young. We were just as rebellious. Give it time. Cassandra placed a hand on his and leaned back into him for support. Her voice was laced with worry as she whispered faintly, "That's what I'm afraid of. She's too much like us." Chapter 38, Chemmouth. Night. Returning after several hours, Orion opened the door to find that both Vander and Benzo had left. He had walked out to the main road to cool off, checking local wanted boards and posters before returning. Locking the door, he lay down on the couch with a heavy sigh, exhaustion catching up to him. Orion rubbed the bridge of his nose, pondering if any of them got away or saw him shoot. Silco was likely in a state of rage after his visit to Vander. Catching wind of C's betrayal after his visit too? He shivered unconsciously at the thought of being near him now. Her thugs knew where I lived. Orion mused, flicking a cup on the table as his thoughts spiraled. I doubt any of them saw me shoot C, and if Silco gets his hands on any survivors, I'll be forced to leave here or sleep with one eye open. Groaning, he sat up, checking his 2 remaining bullets and last chem flash. Stillwater Hold, where most political prisoners or rebels were sent, was on the east side of Piltover, or in other words on the Undercity side. Typical Piltover mentality, Orion thought bitterly. Keep the filth on one side of the river. For lesser offenders usually topside ears, the jail's west side were luxurious in comparison, often reserved for traders or wealthy individuals. He doubted the surviving thugs would remain topside longer than necessary. It would keep them out of Silco's reach, but also out of Orion's too. Prisoner transports were forced to take the main road straight from Progress Bridge, using private iron chutes guarded by enforcers to descend each level of the seams. The transports themselves don't use hexdeck since it hasn't been invented yet. They still relied on horse-drawn iron-caged carriages. Damn it, Orion muttered, running a hand through his hair. I'll have no way of knowing other than by keeping my ears open for a trial. Even then, enforcers could transport them day or night. Delay transportation for days or weeks to avoid an ambush too, especially considering what they were attempting. He clenched his jaw. I don't even know where the kiraman stand on me. No wanted posters have gone out, only ones to report anyone complicit in this incident with a hefty reward. Orion's thoughts drifted back to Vander as he slouched forward, a grim expression settling on his face. Vander has connections to Grayson, but she wouldn't reveal sensitive information to him or me, and definitely won't let me speak to Caitlin alone, not after what just happened, and my absence. Silco. Damn it. Orion cursed internally again, unable to draw any new connections outside of the future scientist and few thugs until after the topside heist. Lost in thought deep into the night, he didn't even remember falling asleep until shattered rays of light struck his eyes, waking him up with a groan. Ah, fuck, he muttered, shielding his eyes. Orion's gaze wandered across the last drops sign, his hands stuffed in his jacket, idly playing with a single silver coin. He had plenty saved up, but the problem he once solved had resurfaced. I need to find a new source of income again. Orion sighed internally before letting go of the coin and pushing open the door into the last drop. Night light. Powder cheered, darting out from the gang performing their usual cleanup chores. A deep chuckle resounded from the background, drawing Orion's attention. Vander nodded in acknowledgement at him and a warm smile as he looked up from wiping down the bar. Rare that he's here for this, but makes sense given what happened, Orion mused, nodding back. Whoa, did you get caught up in the trouble yesterday? Clagger asked, his eyes studying Orion's weary appearance. Milo grinned, leaning on a nearby table. No way. Probably just stayed up late being a retard. Kinda, nothing serious, Orion admitted with a soft chuckle, catching Powder in a tight hug as she ran at him. Powder peeked up at him expectantly, and his eyes twinkled in response. Had to be a nightlight again. Orion added, winking at her. Milo scowled, crossing his arms. What's with that whole nightlight thing anyway? Ow. Six passed by and smacked him lightly on the back of the head. Read the room, she scolded, shaking her head. What do you mean, read the room, you red ape? Milo's comeback and Six's sharp reply faded into the background, with Clagger laughing as the amused audience. Meanwhile, Orion walked with Powder up to the counter. Good to see you made it, Vander greeted cheerfully. Feeling better? Sitting down on a stool, with Powder perched on another and fiddling with her rag as she listened, Orion nodded. Yet, took a while to get my head straight. Hate to jump right into it, but have you heard anything about the incident yesterday? Vander paused briefly, glancing back at Orion before resuming his wipe down of the bar. Nope, Vander said, shaking his head, just that the ones behind it are now 6 feet under. All of them? Orion asked cautiously. Vander nodded, his gaze slowly shifting back to Orion as if weighing him. Vander glanced past him toward the gang still in their argument, then at Powder, whose head tilted with curiosity at their conversation, before shrugging. No loose ends left to cause more trouble. So what happened? Powder chimed in, folding and unfolding her rag as she listened curiously. Well, Vander faintly smiled, leaning forward against the counter and earning her full attention as she perked up with excitement. Some bozos caused a ruckus topside a kidnapping. Locked down half of Piltover. Powder leaned on the counter to meet his gaze with wide, innocent eyes. Did you deal with it? Of course I did, Vander smiled warmly, gently placing a hand on her head. Is that why you're roughed up? Six appeared suddenly next to Orion, making him jump. Aw fuck, Six. He cursed instinctively, sharply exhaling. Chem mouth. Powder pointed at him with an angry glare and Vander chimed in with a firm, albeit tinged with amusement as he tried not to chuckle, tone. No cursing, Orion. Orion's mouth hung open in disbelief, his gaze darting between the two of them before glaring back at Six. She smirked, nudging him playfully with her shoulder. Well? Spill the beans already. Holding her stare with an irritated expression, Orion answered while trying to make it sound casual. I wasn't a part of it. Just got too close caught up in the chaos. Six tucked her chin in, leaning closer with a skeptical look. Because you definitely don't look better when we spar, right? Deciding to be childish in return, Orion stuck his tongue out at her with a short, yep. Powder giggled as Six frowned, her lips curling with upset. Why not just tell me? Aren't we close? We are, Orion nodded and with a reassuring smile, you're just overthinking it. His expression hardened and his tone became more resolute as he added, I did not participate in the kidnapping, Six. Do you really think I'd ever do something like that? Six hesitated, her gaze shifting down for a moment as she muttered, no. Exactly, Orion said, shaking his head with a sigh, I was just stuck in the shitty crossfire between them. Chem mouth. Powder yelled, dramatically pointing at him again. Chapter 39, Unbreakable Fate. That night. Metallic clanging echoed through the room as Milo repeatedly tossed a ball against the metal plate in their lounge. Everyone, except Orion who left early to see Echo before heading home was lounging around, though a simmering irritation lingered amongst the group. Vander and him worked on something together, Six grumbled, her forehead against her hand. Why don't they trust us? She gestured at the group with frustration. Scowling, Milo threw the ball a little harder, Orion's off doing badass jobs, and we're stuck with these lame throwaways. It's not fair. Six stood up abruptly, while Clagger tried to reason. Maybe nothing really happened. Six scoffed. Come on, do you honestly believe that? We've been out late doing gigs for Vander. We don't come back looking like that. Clagger sighed, his tone low and uncertain, yet. Before glancing over at Powder. I just hate being treated like a kid. Powder frowned, fidgeting with her stuffed bunny before asking softly, why don't we do something? Oh, see that? Even Powder agrees. Milo exclaimed, sitting up in disbelief and gesturing dramatically at her. His outburst drew annoyed looks from both Clagger and Powder, but Six's eyes lit up with determination. Her gaze darted around the room before nodding, no. No, you're right. We need to prove we're not kids anymore. Six declared, raising a fist with resolve. We'll show them we're ready. An uncomfortable noise emitted from Clagger as he shifts around, his expression tinged with worry. I don't know, guys. Remember Old Hungry? What if that happens again? Don't worry about that. That was months ago. Six said dismissively, shrugging it off. We got this. I'll find something. The gang exchanged glances, hope flickering faintly in the room. Smirking, Six planted her hands on her hips, tilting her head confidently. We've grown, gang. This time, we'll show them what we're made of. By the end of the day, restrictions across the city had lifted though tensions remained high. There was no news of trials, only an emergency meeting from the council to address the kidnapping and crime in the Undercity. Orion saw nothing implicating him, which brought some relief. Throughout the week, he searched the Sump Coast for any factories but found nothing connected to Silco. He informed Vander of his search, who grunted in reluctant agreement, instructing him to immediately report any findings and not to engage. By week's end, with no results, Orion decided to start searching along the river line instead. On the bright side, he had been collecting various gears, fans, and mechanical components during his outings, tossing them into his old brown sack. After sleeping and heading out early, Orion found himself walking to the last drop again to deliver more goodies to an eager Powder before stopping by Benzo's shop. Powder had a growing collection of explosion gadgets, none of them working of course, but it was still cute. "Hey Powder!" "More parts," Orion called out as he briskly walked through the door before coming to an abrupt halt. The gang, usually cleaning at this time, wasn't there. Frowning, he searched both the front and back but didn't find them. Weird. I guess they went to the arcade. Orion thought, heading over there. Yet again, no gang. Uncertainty started to prickle at Orion's conscience, his grip tightening on the bag. Where is everyone? Orion, puzzled, paced toward Benzo's shop, racking his brain for any events happening today. As he rounded the corner, he spotted Echo bouncing in place at the entrance with a wrench in hand, waving enthusiastically. "You got more parts?" Echo called out eagerly. Orion chuckled with some relief as he approached. Echo's energy mirrored Powder when he got excited, his eyes widening at the size of the bag. "Awesome! I get first dibs?" Echo asked, bouncing between his feet even faster, his arms close to his chest with excitement. "It seems like it's your lucky day." Orion nodded, smiling as he set the bag down for Echo to dive into. "Say, have you seen the gang? I haven't run into them at all this morning." Echo paused, his arms completely inside the bag. "Oh, Six said they had something important to do. Didn't tell me much, though." Shrugging, he resumed digging and continued to respond nonchalantly. "You know how she gets when she has a plan, gets all secretive and stuff, usually when it's for a gig." Orion stiffened, his mind was racing as he looked up at the morning sky. Thoughts were coming to him, and he wasn't liking it. Echo looked up at him curiously. "Why? Did something happen? You look on edge." "Echo." Orion began slowly, "Remember how I asked you to keep an eye out for any fancy topsider who comes down and doesn't haggle?" "Yet!" Echo exclaimed, standing abruptly. With expectation for praise, he rapidly shot out, "He came after you left yesterday. I did what you said and charged him triple." "How did you know? Is he a super wealth merchant?" "Oh yeah, yours is inside AAA." Echo words were cut off when Orion suddenly grabbed his shoulders, hands trembling. His actions completely unnerved Echo, who saw the panic and fear in his eyes. "Hey, I did what you asked. What's wrong?" Echo stammered fearfully, his gaze darting between the ground and Orion. Fearing the answer, Orion sucked in a sharp, deep breath before asking, "Echo, did you follow him when I told you not to?" No response came, only a guilty look cast toward the ground. "Echo!" Orion unconsciously shouted, causing him to jump and yelp in his grasp. "Tell me how to get there, now." Chapter 40, Through the Pain. Orion wheezed, gasping for air as he reached the elevator, sprinting as fast as he could while leaving a frightened Echo behind. Which timeline is this? Does this match the show, or does Six die, or the one where they all die because of me? Orion's thoughts spiraled wildly in panic as he jumped into the elevator with a few strangers. The other passengers stared at him like he was crazy, leaning away from his stench and panting. Orion barely noticed, too preoccupied with the storm in his mind. By the time he reached the bridge, Orion had slowed himself to a steadier pace, desperate to regain control of his breathing so that he could function upon arrival. "With how much they have to sneak to reach the workshop undetected, I should be able to make it," he thought, trying to reassure himself. Despite all of this, his heartbeat and breathing remained erratic. Orion shook his head, gritting his teeth. "I can't make that assumption, I need to speed up." Channeling the offensive magic, Orion focused it into his legs and accelerated. People shouted as he darted past with dangerous speed, some hurling insults or objects in his direction. Orion cut the travel time in half, at least using his magic. He rounded a corner into an alley, earning disgusted glances from passers-by just before he disappeared inside. Orion's eyes scanned the lining of pipes and ridges along the wall, quickly spotting a suitable place to climb. Anyone watching would have found it terrifying as Orion launched himself multiple feet to various ledges, powered by his magic. The climb was reckless, to say the least. By the time he reached the top, he was gasping for air and had to stop channeling. His body felt like it was on fire, the magic tearing through his muscles, amplifying the pain of every movement. For a fleeting moment, Orion glanced up. The scene was majestic, airships flying above, but the awe was only temporary as he resumed running. His pace slowed considerably on the roof to avoid falling, but it was still frantic. Minutes later, he reached the spot where the gang had jumped in the opening scene of Arcane. Orion grunted, sliding down the side of the roof onto a balcony and launching himself across to the next. Scrambling up, his eyes locked onto the workshop in the distance and the gang. 6 had just kicked open the door, with the gang following close behind her. Orion's heart skipped a beat. Knowing he didn't have much time, he resumed channeling his magic, speeding up. Multiple times he slipped during this panic. At one point, a sharp edge tore through his shirt, making him wince in pain, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. There was no time to recover. Breathing out, he cut the channel after reaching the workshop's roof, a dull pain throbbing through his legs as they started to shake. Dropping down and gripping the ledge, he launched himself onto the balcony. //6 POV// 6's hand shot up, causing Milo and Clagger to freeze as they heard rattling from the rooftop above. Someone followed us? Milo asked, bewildered, raising a brow in disbelief. Clagger stepped closer to 6, clenching his fists in anticipation of a fight. Did little man tell other people, 6? 6 shook her head. Not that I know of, she replied cautiously. Before she could say more, they heard a faint sliding sound followed by a figure launching itself onto the balcony. Orion. 6 said, startled, her eyes scanning his disheveled and exhausted appearance. Her gaze landed on his wound, concern flickering in her mind. How did he get hurt? The thought was fleeting though as Orion's voice snapped her back to the moment. Get out! Get out all of you! Orion said harshly, his voice strained as he stormed in and glared at them. 6 flinched, a painful tickle burning at her heart before irritation replaced it. No, she replied flatly, crossing her arms and meeting his glare with a defiant one of her own. 6 heard the other 2 shuffling up behind her, believing they were ready to back her up. She straightened up her posture, unwilling to let Orion ruin this. Everything's fine. You're the one getting in our way. She whispered furiously. Cling clang. Loud, sharp metallic ringing cut through their argument from the hallway, silencing everyone. All of their gazes shifted toward the door as a shadowy figure started to block the light shining through its stained windows. Milo. 6 hissed. Milo was already moving, grabbing the chair next to him and darting over, jamming it under the door handle. Powder sprinted past, giggling excitedly as Milo secured the door. Hello? Is someone in there? A calm voice rang out from outside with an edge of suspicion. Orion, you're here. Powder's delighted whisper rang out as she dashed out onto the balcony. Hey, open up. The voice carried urgency, followed by slams as the person attempted to break down the door. Within a few seconds of her initial command, Milo, Clagger, and Powder were already on the balcony. 6 reached for her satchel but before she could grab it, she felt Orion wrap his arms around her. Orion twisted around and crouched to the floor with her tight in his grip. Frantic and furious, thrashing wildly, she whispered harshly, Hey, what are you? Her words were cut off by a deafening explosion. The shockwave rippled through, throwing light, heat, and debris across the room, accompanied by a series of sharp cries or panicked shouts from everyone. At first it was just one, but within a split second 2 more explosions detonated, almost simultaneously. 6 shrieked, her ears ringing as a bright flash stole her vision. The bright light and concussive impacts around her instinctively forced her eyes shut. She curled her body without thinking, clutching onto Orion for safety as she held her breath in fear. Her breaths came back in ragged gasps, ears ringing painfully. The first thing she noticed through the haze was the strange warmth something dripping onto her. Slowly, she forced her eyes open, white specks dotting her blurred vision that slowly began to clear. She saw was red dripping down onto her arm. Orion, 6 croaked, tilting her head slightly off the ground. What hap? She gasped, eyes going wide as realization hit. Her head whipped down to see pools of blood on her clothes and sprayed out across the ground around her. It wasn't hers, she felt no sharp pain after quick pats to check herself. 6's gaze shot upward, locking onto Orion's face with growing horror. Orion! She whispered, her voice trembling. Surrounding them was a semicircle of twisting colors, moving outward like a tide before curving and crashing back into itself. It formed a shimmering, deep blue translucent shield with veins of black and red pulsing and twisting through it like living threads. Orion was at the center of it. Some of the energy spiked out like jagged lightning or crystalline shards, piercing his body, his side, his shoulder and leg, anchoring him above her like a grotesque puppet. What is this? 6 whispered, fear mingling with confusion and shock as her eyes darted from the corrupted glowing shield to the injuries and back to Orion's pale, bloody face. His bloodshot eyes rolled upward in a daze, breaths shallow and weak. You're alive. 6. Chapter 41, Despair. Written from my phone, lost power. Reread multiple times, hopefully despite the lack of grammar/sentence structure fixing it still came out well /good flow. /Orion POV. It was like lightning shooting through him, everything unfolding in slow motion as powder darted out. She's too early. Orion froze for a second, the shock of realization hitting like a cold flash, his breath catching in his throat. Without thinking he grabbed 6 and twisted her around, away from the wall, crouching protectively to shield her. He heard the faint giggling of a happy child in the background like the call of death. Ugh! Orion grunted as her elbows and knees slammed into him. His control wavered, channeling his limits of the archaic protective, light blue mana into a shield around them rather than fortifying his body. Hey, what are you? 6's words were cut off through the deafening explosion. The shield he created around them flashed wildly with brilliant colors upon the first explosion. It felt like a heavy weight pressing down on him from behind, threatening to shatter the shield and kill them both. A split second in, the distinct sounds of 2 more explosions detonated, changing everything. Orion's shield changed colors as the intense and unstable wild magic impacted it. Corruption blossomed from the core, spreading out like roots through his shields. It was surreal how he could feel it happen. Weakened by the corruption, debris and splinters broke through at various points. Rather than simply breaking through and impaling Orion, however, the arcane magic bent itself at the 3 points of impact, piercing through him. There were more breakages, but they didn't impact Orion and expanded the jagged lighting and crystallized shards appearance. Orion's vision faded to black for a moment. Blood poured out from the wounds, and he coughed mouthfuls up, spraying it across 6. His vision faded in and out, unable to focus beyond the pain and his fading grasp on the corrupted magic. Orion! The whisper cut through his struggle like a knife, slowly reviving him back to consciousness. What is this? Her terrified whisper echoed in his head. His eyes finally rolled upward to her. Orion couldn't help but feel sad, her traumatized expression with tear-struck eyes, trembling hands and body. That look, I feel like the villain. Orion weakly thought, his vision shaking. You're alive. 6. Orion hoarsely whispered. Blood dripped from his mouth onto her forehead when he spoke. /6's POV // Alive. 6's voice shook, her gaze shifting to their surroundings. Charred walls, large splinters of wood and glass sprayed out, and concrete chunks laying at the base of Orion's feet with blue archaic lightning streaking out from the stone. She shivered, her head whipping around. Powder! She fearfully whispered. Powder and the gang groaned, struggling back to their feet. Everyone was fine, just rattled. Everyone except Orion. Hold on, Orion. 6 wiggled out more, slipping in the blood. You're bleeding everywhere. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. She cried between sobs. Her hands trembled, hovering above the arcane shards piercing him. We will get you out. Don't, Orion drew in a ragged breath, halting her fingertips just before touching the shards, and croaked, it will fade. 6 leaned back, her fingers retracting with a scared squeak. The shards vibrated angrily, the deep blue shifting into reddish-black before dissipating with a hiss along with the shield. Debris and wood chunks fell with noisy wet splats. 6 caught Orion as it let go of him, hiccuping and crying openly as shocked gasps rang out behind her. Jace? Jace! A feminine voice cried out from the door with frantic footsteps. Orion's gurgled voice rasped out next to 6's ear. Powder, nightlight, remember. A momentary pause and a raspy breath. Clagger, grab 6. Run. 6 felt small hands tugging at her arm as she held tightly onto him. She glanced back, seeing Powder's previously delighted face now tear-stained with snot dribbling out between sobs. Powder had her hesitancy, tugging at Six's arm with uncertain glances at Orion and crying. "Will you get better?" Six felt him nod, believing it to be obvious fake reassurance, tears blinding her completely through renewed cries. A loud rumbling was heard as a section of the balcony began to collapse. "Orion, I'm SOR wait no. Get off me!" Six shrieked as Claggor came up and ripped her away. Orion's weak body fell flat with a wet splotch into the blood and a pained groan. Shouts and screams echoed out from the streets below. She couldn't recall what she was shouting in the moment when Claggor forcibly pulled her head up to his, locking gazes. "Do you want to lose Powder too? We need to run!" Claggor shouted in her face. His eyes were tear-stained and horrified too, but determined as well. Six hiccuped. She knew it was Orion's last will, nodding slowly and reluctantly. The traumatized gang retreated to the roof, each giving one last horrified and remorseful glance back except for Powder. Powder's eyes carried hope. Six saw her eyes widen further relief. Six felt she saw wrong, shaking her head through shaky breaths and tears as the escape chase began. Orion's POV // It was rare to see Milo at a loss for words. Shell-shocked and horrified disbelief etched into his expression as he stared at Orion. Likewise, he had never seen such determination in Claggor up until that point. Claggor's grit and Powder's belief in him were the only reason they managed to pull Six away. Even through the pain, Orion felt his heart ripped apart with guilt as he was forced to watch Six's heartbreaking attempt to claw back to him. In front of them all, a faint green light already started to glow over his wounds to reduce the severity. He knew with all the exertion to get there, shielding them from the explosion, and the intense magical rebound, that was all he could do. Only Powder recognized it, her eyes lighting up with hope as Orion weakly smiled back to reassure her before she left. His mana drizzled away, his wounds still open but not as severe. Orion rolled slowly onto his back, unable to move beyond that. His vision was a blur, slowly darkening as everything faded. Just before he fell unconscious, he heard a familiar feminine voice from the doorway. "Orion." Chapter 42, Between Hope and Horror. / Gang POV. One by one, they fell down the chute into a trash pile, escaping the enforcers. "What the hell happened back there?" Claggor demanded angrily as he sat up, his breaths coming in heavy heaves as the scene replayed over and over in his head. Milo shook his head, staring at the ground in shock now that they had a moment. "I can't believe we left him." Milo's voice cracked, disbelief lacing his words. Everyone's gaze slowly shifted to Powder. She honestly didn't know, glaring back at everyone. Her face was still stained with tears. "It wasn't my fault," Powder retorted with emotion and aggression. She cast her gaze down at the trash. "Orion will make it back." Her expression softened, hope lifting her tone as she looked back at everyone. "You all saw it. That was magic. That's what it was." Six croaked, her voice low as her eyes flickered on Powder. Powder nodded eagerly, her tone growing brighter. "Yet. He can heal people. He healed your forehead, Six." They exchanged uncertain glances before Claggor slowly spoke up. "So, he's like those stories we've read? The ones topsiders warn people about. He's not bad." Powder snapped, glaring at Claggor, an unusual display of defiance. "You saw him. He was trying to stop us. To protect us again." Claggor winced, and the gang fell into silence. They couldn't argue against Powder. Even Milo glanced at her before his gaze returned to the trash. He said nothing, guilt edged across his face as he pulled his legs in close. Six, doubtful as visions of his bloodied face replayed, softly asks, "Can he recover from that?" Powder opened her mouth initially before uncertainty took hold. A small breath escaped her, a feeling of realization dawning on her and disillusionment from her ambitious hope. They could see her expression, her imaginary bunny ears, falling with depression and shoulders slumping. "We should move." Six's voice struggled to carry any resolve or determination. Only despair. "Vander needs to know." Caitlin POV. "Jace? Jace." Caitlin stumbled to Jace in the hallway, who had collapsed after the explosion. They had just returned from a local shop, picking up more tools for his experiments. Her head and ears rang from the blast, and Jace looked injured. Stumbling closer, Caitlin could hear shrieks and cries of sorrow coming inside. "Those sound like kids." "A robbery." Caitlin thought, slowing her pace and moving cautiously. Her eyes fixed on the door in case someone ran out. When Caitlin reached him, she whispered with frantic worry, "Jace." As she touched his neck, a small breath of relief escaped her when she felt a pulse. Her eyes scanned him, searching quickly for injuries but finding none, just soot and small cuts from debris. Inside, the chaos continued. The cries grew louder, piercing her ears, making her wince with sympathy, and causing her heart to skip a beat. A loud rumble started to shake the ground beneath her, forcing her to brace protectively around Jace. "No! Get off me!" Anguished cries echoed out from inside. Caitlin breathed out and tried wrapping her arms under Jace's shoulders, pulling. Despite her efforts, he barely budged. Her gaze snapped to the blown-out windows, catching hazy figures retreating through the smoke. Caitlin pulled harder, managing to jerk Jace away from the door. "Orion!" A tearful scream echoed through the air, "It's my fault. Let me go." Caitlin froze. "What?" "No," she thought, her stomach sinking. "We need to run." Another voice, thick with emotion, snapped her back to reality. She let go of Jace, standing with raised fists, anticipating them to charge out in their escape. Nothing. Seconds ticked by. Still, nothing, just an eerie silence and faint shouts from the outside streets below. Every muscle in her body tensed, her heart pounding. Why aren't they running? Caitlin gritted her teeth, the memory of the cultivar flashing in her mind, her injured family, the helplessness, and watching Orion flee. Jace was already hurt. Was she going to let this continue? With a sharp inhale, those childish voices from inside echoing in her mind, she stepped forward and kicked the door open. She tensed again, ready for a fight, but nothing happened. Her eyes scanned the room, fear tickling at her subconscious with subtle, instant regret for her choice. Caitlin couldn't believe her eyes. Charred walls, shattered debris across the room, and at the center a horrifying sight. Orion. She trembled unconsciously, her fists falling to her sides. His body was drenched in blood. Even from the entrance, she could see it sprayed across the floor. Ugh! Caitlin vomited, tears blurring her vision. Her gaze flicked to the shattered balcony, piecing together the horrific scene. Breathing heavily, she trembled and took a hesitant step closer to the bloodied figure sprawled on the floor. Caitlin froze as Orion's head turned slowly, his bloodshot eyes locking onto her. A faint, knowing smirk tugged at his lips before his eyes closed again. She couldn't believe it, he was alive? Caitlin stared in disbelief at the multiple injuries covering his body. "What are you?" she choked, panic rising in her voice. "Someone help!" she shouted, crouching next to Orion, her skirt soaking in the blood pooled around him and her hands putting pressure on his side. The door, creaking closed behind her, burst open as if to answer the call. Marcus, an enforcer officer, and 2 other enforcers charged into the room, coming to an abrupt halt. Their eyes widened in shock at the scene before them. Marcus's gaze flickered with sorrow between Caitlin's tearful and shaken expression, and the bloodied body on the floor. "He's still alive," Caitlin stammered out, her face pale and voice trembling. Her arms shook as she applied pressure to Orion's side, hands covered with blood. Marcus's expression hardened, speaking firmly as he gestured her away. "Step away, kiraman. Let us handle this." Caitlin obeyed, rising slowly and stepping aside without a word. Her mind reeled, unable to make sense of it all. Why was this happening again, she thought bitterly, her gaze flicking back to Jace with enforcers attending him. Raising her hands, Caitlin felt her heart pounding through her chest. Her vision blurred and shook, unable to contain herself as she vomited again, body shaking. Caitlin barely registered the hands that gently gripped her shoulders, guiding her away. Her mind was fogged, the delayed shock finally overtaking her senses. The vivid horror replayed in her mind over and over, drowning her thoughts away. Marcus waved to an enforcer and commanded, "Get her out of here." An enforcer walked past Caitlin and reported, "He's alive, just concussed." Marcus nodded sharply and pointed at Orion, "Find a doctor or an alchemist. This one's still alive. We need answers." The words echoed in Caitlin's mind as she was guided away, her body trembling. Glancing back, she clung to those words, a flicker of hope piercing the haze of despair. Chapter 43, Where's Orion? Gang POV, alleyway on their way back. Deckard, a kid from a rival gang, lounged about on a box as the gang passed him. He casually called out, "Did you finally get him killed?" "What?" Six snapped, coming to an abrupt halt. The four of them turned to glare at him. Smirking, Deckard hopped off the box. Everyone saw him running across the Undercity across topside. His tone was taunting, dripping with venom. We may not have seen eye to eye, but we liked Orion. Now here you are. Deckard's smirk faded, replaced by an unfriendly sneer. Two of his friends stepped into view behind the gang, their fists clenched. An explosion topside, no hall, no Orion. Just covered in blood. I wonder whose. He mocked with disdain. Claggor stepped forward angrily, shouting, "We didn't kill him." Everyone started to tense, readying to fight. Powder wasn't having it either, her little fists balled up, and her face scrunched in fury. Then where is he? Did you leave him behind? Deckard raised an eyebrow, his tone sharp and accusatory. When the gang didn't respond, he spat on the ground. Filthy sump rats! Abandoning one of ours to the topside ears. Six closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly before she opened them again. She raised her fists as anger started taking hold. We didn't leave him behind. And you talk too much. With that, the brawl between the gangs erupted. Deckard's gang didn't stand a chance with their heightened anger and emotions. By the end of it, Six and Powder were stomping on Deckard, not giving him a chance to reach for his knife. It wasn't until multiple broken bones and concussions that they stopped. They left Deckard's gang groaning in pain on the cold pavement and continued back to the last drop. Last drop, backroom. Vander, breathing heavily, barged through the door. Word had already reached him. He was waiting for their return, having plenty of time to think about how to scold them. When Vander saw them enter the last drop, however, with Six covered in blood and the others looking bruised, it all vanished. Six and Powder were huddled together on the couch, their eyes puffy. Powder especially, had a slight shake in her body from the emotions throughout the day. Claggor and Milo sat on the other sofa, silent and pale, flinching when Vander stormed in. They were all rubbing their bruises and injuries from the street fight. The room was heavy with tension, grief, and upset. Vander rushed downstairs to Six. What were you all thinking, going topside? Vander scolded angrily, cupping Six's blood-smeared face. Are you hurt? Is everyone all right? I'm sorry, Six whimpered. Vander paused. Six's apology wasn't like her usual self. Something was wrong. Standing abruptly, Vander rushed to the shelf to retrieve the medical kit. Worry ate away at his heart, the fear of losing her. Don't worry, we'll get you fixed up, Six. She's fine, that blood isn't hers mostly. Claggor's voice cut through the silence behind him, prompting him to pause. Vander turned slowly. Then whose blood is? It's Orion's. Six croaked. His pace slowed considerably before he placed it on the table. He heard the tales of a boy running frantically across the city. Vander whispered, "Where is he?" Six trembled, unable to meet his gaze, while Powder hiccuped. She clutched Six's arm, curling into a ball against her. Both Milo and Claggor looked down with guilt, unable to muster a response. Vander's voice dropped to a low rumble, his gaze hardening. "Where's Orion?" Vander demanded again, his words sharper as he looked around for an answer. "Answer me," he growled with a dangerous edge entering his tone. "What happened?" Six forced herself to speak, her voice trembling. "Orion, he came to stop us. Everything was going fine until the explosion." Vander interrupted, his voice tinged with dread. "There was blood everywhere," Six said, her voice cracking as the imagery flooded back into her mind, tears swelling once more. "He's dead." Vander whispered in shock, staggering backward as his breath hitched before leaving him in one go. Milo's faint voice broke the tension. "We left him," he whispered, guilt in every word. Claggor's voice broke through with anger and emotion. "We didn't leave him. He told us to run. Orion didn't want us to get caught too. So is he dead or not?" Vander asked, the dangerous edge returning to his voice as his fists clenched tighter. When no one answered, he slammed one on the table, the sound echoing in the room. "Answer me!" Vander roared like never before. Some of the commotion in the bar above quieted. Everyone jumped, startled by the outburst. Powder shrieked and cried harder as she clung to Six for comfort and safety. Six cupped Powder's head protectively and finally spoke through the tears. "We don't know. He said he would be fine. He used magic to save Six. Claggor blurted out, voice cracking under the tension. Claggor and Milo were both leaning away from Vander's fury in fear. He continued hurriedly, that's why we don't know. Powder said he could heal himself. Vander's fury faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing as it shifted between the group. Magic? What? He snapped, his tone losing its sharpness. Powder whimpered out through her crying from the opposite side, muffled into Six's side. It's true. I called him Nightlight because I saw him use it at night. She glanced up at Six with tear-stained cheeks. He healed her head when thugs kidnapped her and hurt her. Vander blinked several times, trying to process her words. Shaking his head with frustration, he growled, and you didn't think to tell anyone? To tell me? Peering out from Six's protective grip, she whimpered, he told me not to tell anyone. Because of what might happen. Closing his eyes, Vander didn't say any more. Silent tension gripped the room as Vander started to piece together oddities about Orion, like his unusual strength or speed during times of danger. When he opened his eyes, and was met with fearful anticipation. Vander sighed with disappointment. Listen to me, all of you. Vander straightened, his voice low but commanding. The enforcers will be out looking for you. Don't leave here until I get back, understand? The kids quickly nodded, and Vander turned to leave. If Orion doesn't make it back, Vander's voice was hollow and heavy. This one's on all of us. With that, he left, leaving the gang behind in stunned silence. Powder reached out and grabbed the stuffed bunny next to her with Six. Orion will come back, Powder whispers into it, he always comes back. He promised. Chapter 43.5, Events in Action, Short, D. Quick crossover, plenty of unoriginality. Day 1 of Crisis. Vander walks back in moments later with a hardened expression after assigning someone to watch the counter. Claggor, come with me. Tell me everything that happened in detail. Claggor jumps up, yes sir, and runs out from the group to him. The rest of the gang follows his leaving, not daring to interject. Benzo's shop, that night / After reaching Benzo's shop, Claggor waits outside and talks with Echo, who jumps in place asking excited questions. They believed it was the right thing to do, Benzo replied to Vander's struggle with the kids. You can't protect them forever. Benzo looks down at his drink and adds, still, I can't believe that kid was a mage. It explains a lot. Vander sighs, It feels like one of the many puzzle pieces. There's more. He's a kid with a lot of secrets. I wouldn't be surprised if he had more at this point. And someone was following them, Vander added, swirling his drink. Benzo joked, a whole lot of someones from what I heard. Not enforcers, Vander cuts his joking off with a serious tone. His gaze lowered, his expression darkening. With this timing, there is only one other person who comes to mind. Silco. Benzo breathed out his name like a curse, frowning with displeasure. Vander nodded, clutching his arm brace, a firm reminder of their past conflict. If Orion's alive, Silco will see this as an opportunity, Vander mused openly, the grip on his arm tightening. And if he can't save and corrupt the boy, then he'll make him a martyr. Vander gave a wry smile, He's smart. But this time, we have the edge. Looking down, Benzo was about to say something when the door opened, a chime of bells ending the conversation abruptly. Grayson and Marcus stepped into the shop. While Grayson looked amiable, Marcus, even with a mask on, held a look of disgust and hostility. Vander stared down at his drink, swirling it in his cup as Marcus stepped around him and the hidden meeting began. Abandoned factory / You were supposed to watch them and not interfere, Silco's low tone echoed across the observatory. Deckard grunted as a pipe was held to his throat. I'm sorry. They just caught us by surprise. He lied, trying to excuse himself. Now his accomplice is asking questions about you, Silco flicked the injection device, his crimson eye glowing angrily. And that's not a risk I'm willing to take. With the pipe pressed harshly against his throat, Deckard sputtered out, the kids. It was their fault, the explosion in the upper city. Silco didn't let out even a grunt as he injected his corrupted eye with a needle and serum. That was them. Silco tilted his head. What about the other boy? Spittle flew out from Deckard's mouth, they left him behind. That girl was covered in his blood, I think. It didn't sound like he was dead. He said in a panic, legs thrashing about as more pressure was applied. Vander's in trouble. So is Orion. Silco mused, touching the corrupted skin around his eye. Standing up he casually strolls past them. Smartest thing you've said, boy. Get him a meal. The thugs begin dragging him off. Our timelines moved up. Silco sighs, glancing to Singed as they begin further experiments with Shimmer. Comment. 15 comment. Vote. 1 left. Chapter 57, Chapter 43.6, Why? Short D. Thank you, but fuck you Lakerus 43, winky face. I listened to The Lamb and the Wolf, kindred voices multiple times trying to write this because of you while drunk. I wrote most of this while drinking. Felt it was ironically appropriate. It was awesome. And depressing. I'll fix the grammar and structure when I wake, but I had to write it and display it. Behold. Raw and drunk writing. / Orion's POV // Why can't we kill it? Its time has not yet come. A tearful, snarling cry rings out from the abyss. If it has 2 faces, can't we enjoy 2 chases? Orion's eyes shoot open, face to face with a magnificent black dire wolf wearing a black mask and a humanoid white lamb wearing a similarly colored black one, though it stood farther behind it. Why do you resist? This is not your world. The lamb cooed. Orion breathed heavily, looking around this plane of existence. It shimmered grey and white, like peaceful flames on cold embers. It may not be my universe, but I want them to live happily. Why? Your existence is unwelcome, the lamb snuffed, looking into the distance. The wolf snarls, this weak will is why you died. Your weakness, this pitiful existence. It taints the chase of a pure soul. Yet you cannot kill me. Orion shouted, waving his arm furiously. The wolf snarled at his response. I will fight. I've killed so many. Those who haven't yet experienced loss may never know what it means to take a life. But I do. It grieves, the wolf whimpers, tilting its head. The lamb hums, it feels unique, but it is not. It ignores the suffering of many, the cause of many more. The wolf howls, but can we not chase it once more? It cries like us. It is fake. It is a lie. The lamb shakes its head. She tilts her bow up, a radiating blue arrow pointing at Orion. We should kill it. The meat will sour, the taint will ruin its flavor, should we not wait? The wolf reasons. The lamb hums, taking its time. Orion glares at the arrow, raging at everything, his sacrifices, his pain, everything. He speaks slowly, I will survive. Choose your favorite, but I will survive. With that Orion lunges out, trying to push the bow aside and punch the lamb. She easily dodges, however, allowing his arm to slip past her head. You will submit, sooner or later. Your soul is not strong. Orion felt as if he had been violated as her eyes, swirling like galaxies, knowing here and beyond, pierced his soul. He wanted to vomit, but he raged, trying to headbutt her. My existence means something. Orion cries out. It was then when he woke up, shouting with rage and covered in bandages, that he abruptly sat up. Orion. Chapter 44, Condemned in Silence. / Next day after the incident / Orion jolted upright in a bed, a sharp pain shooting through his wounds. His head buzzed, and an unusual clarity sharpened his vision as he looked over his bandaged body. I'm not dead. I can move, he thought, bewildered. Looking at his hands, he noticed an unnatural shine to everything. Even his breathing felt hypersensitive, drawing his focus for a moment. Spirit tonic, a voice broke the silence. Grayson stood near the bed with Marcus at her side, observing him with a deadpan expression as she calmly spoke. It's from Ionia. I would not suggest trying anything, its effects will wear off shortly. What does it do? Orion asked, their distance shifting closer and fading with each breath. Orion's eye caught several old men near the door wearing enforcer uniforms, scribbling on paper every word. You don't have the right to ask, Marcus snarled, but Grayson waved him to silence. She looked at Marcus disapprovingly. Marcus threw a frustrated glance but complied before they turned back to Orion. It's a stimulant, a temporary boost. We need answers. Grayson said dismissively. She gestured toward his wounds. You're lucky to be alive. The kiramans paid a hefty sum for elixirs. Without them, you would be dead. Orion lowered his gaze for a moment, his voice bitter. Why? I just told you answers, Grayson exhaled sharply. Her tone grew colder. You are the primary lead in this investigation. This is the second topside attack in a month, both tied to the Kiraman family. The council wants answers. Please cooperate, Orion. Grayson's voice softened. We don't want to resort to other methods. Orion paused, remembering the disaster in Caitlyn's face just before he passed out. After nodding slowly, Marcus immediately asked, why the attack? People were injured because of you. Orion's gaze shifted to Marcus. It wasn't an attack. They were just kids trying to prove themselves. Heightened breathing and stress caused his vision to brighten further. He clutched his head and winced, closing his eyes as a massive headache took hold. I was trying to stop them. Kids. Grayson trailed off in frustration, looking down for a moment in thought. She shook her head, but that doesn't explain the explosion. Gritting his teeth through the pain, his headache grew worse as well as the pain around his wounds. He was forced to lay down as he answered. I don't know either. Everything just exploded. Silence followed. Orion was unable to see their reaction as he covered his eyes to stop the light. He was struggling to stay conscious at this point. They lost their bag of stolen goods during the chaos, Marcus stated factually. We don't know if they carried any on their persons. Orion, tell us. Did they take anything else? Grayson asked, her tone desperate as she shook his leg, trying to keep him focused and conscious. No. Orion muttered as his consciousness slipped away. He could hear angry cursing from Marcus as everything faded. Names. Give us names. Damn it. Throughout the day he faded in and out of consciousness, unable to do further. Even if he wanted to heal, enforcers stood guard to report his actions when he woke up. Later that day the council convened for Jace Talus's trial. While the ethos demanded for his exile after Jace revealed he was trying to create magic, certain influences and favoritism kept him from such a fate. Shortly after, the council convened again, but with the presence of Grayson and Marcus for a debriefing on the attack, and without Heimerdinger. You said this was a robbery. Did they take anything dangerous? Mel asked. Hard to say. Grayson reports. We don't exactly know what we did find, let alone what we didn't. It appears they lost most of it during the explosion. This mention of magic has the people afraid. Haskell speaks politically. The culprits must be apprehended. Your attitude makes me question if your best is up to the task, Salo sneered. Oh, we'll find them. Don't worry. Marcus responded aggressively. We've conducted exhaustive interrogations, frozen commerce for half the district. With all due respect, counselor, don't you think we've pushed them hard enough? Grayson tried to reason with them. Do whatever it takes. Balbach's angered robotic voice erupted. Turn the Undercity upside down if you have to. Mel, contemplative, tapped her fingers on her arm. What of the one culprit? Is he still alive? Cassandra's gaze flickered, her eyes quickly darting from Mel and back to Grayson. Yes. Grayson replied. He wasn't directly involved in the incident. Witnesses reported him sprinting across the city moments before the explosion. When forced awake with spirit tonic, he claimed to be stopping them. That's it. Shola scoffed. Grayson remained composed. He lost consciousness. His injuries are severe. If he knew where they'd be, then he knows who they are, Mel mused aloud. Marcus stepped forward, confidence dripping from his tone. We'll get names out of him. It won't take long. Good. Haskell chuckles merrily as if the problem vanished. Salo sharply glared at Haskell before turning back to Grayson. The people still want answers. Keep scouring the Undercity until he wakes. Wring those answers from his neck if you must. Marcus's smirk grew, but Cassandra's cold tone cut through the air like a knife. As the victim of yet another attack, and the one who paid to keep him alive, you shall not. Cassandra declared with a cold tone, her glare fixed on Salo who leaned back in confusion. You? Why would you pay such an exorbitant amount to keep that filthy rat alive? For exactly this purpose. He owe me a debt now. Mel cut her off, we cannot allow him to roam free. He is still complicit. He knew this would happen. Cassandra opened her mouth to protest when Mel gave her a cold stare. We were lenient enough with Jace Talus this morning. That's enough. Balbox mercilessly pressed further. Send him to the dredge prison. Let him rot there. Mel and Shola exchanged glances and shook their heads. Shola spoke first, that is too harsh for the boy. After all, he did try to stop it. An example must be made. Ballbox Gears grinned and screeched with rage. 2 attacks in 1 month are unacceptable. Mel nodded thoughtfully, 2 is unacceptable. I agree. She paused before adding, still water works well. It keeps him off the streets, and it's reserved for high-profile criminals. Let that be the compromise. Grayson remained silent as the council discussed Orion's fate away from the public eye. Later there would be a public trial, but his fate was already being determined here. Comment. 36 comment. Vote. 1 left. Chapter 59, Chapter 44.5, My Body's on the Line, Short. / Day 3 after the explosion topside / If you don't give names before the trial this evening, the council will order your transfer to Dredge Prison instead, Grayson said, sitting alone beside Orion who was laid out in the dimly lit cell. The doctors had just left after changing Orion's bandages and applying fresh ointments and antiseptics. Orion's breaths came short and raspy, struggling to stay awake. He was receiving food, but it was nowhere near the quantity or quality to restore his energy for healing, let alone being given the time to heal. While drifting in and out of consciousness previously, he desperately wanted to heal himself, but new questions would arise if he did. The only thing Orion could do was grit his teeth and endure the pain. Why don't you ask Vander instead? Orion croaked. Grayson blinked, staring at him for a moment. He told you. We've talked. Orion curtly replied. A frown formed before she shook her head, letting it pass. Regardless, the council knows you're connected to those kids. I spoke to Vander already, and the result was the same. Orion, please. Think about Caitlin, she wouldn't want this. Grayson pleaded, trying various tactics to convince him. I know you had no part in this, and so do many others. Don't throw your life away over this. A few names will reduce your sentence from 10 years to 5 and in better conditions. Her eyes drifted to Orion's hands as they clenched into fists. Anger stirred within him as he forcibly turned his head to lock gazes with Grayson. The council knows but doesn't care. They care, but for different reasons, Grayson carefully spoke, realizing she had just erred. The council needs their pound of flesh. They have to make the field people safe, Orion bitterly mocked, groaning as his wounds flared in pain. I know what I am to them, a political pawn. I'm screwed no matter what. Silence lingered between them. Grayson's expression softened as she spoke again, lamenting to Orion, your mind truly is bright, Orion. If only you weren't so heavily involved in the Undercity's criminal acts, you could have been at the academy alongside Jace and the others. After another pause, Orion finally gave a firm response. No. Grayson couldn't help but turn her head away in anguish, standing up. If you change your mind, tell the guards standing outside, Grayson whispered and left without saying another word. Orion wanted to heal and escape now. The thought of spending a lifetime in prison being tortured and working as a slave in the mines was unbearable. If he recalled correctly, that would be the prison Urgot would eventually appear if he wasn't already there. He felt like he had had enough. If I tell her, I condemn the others, and I've sacrificed too much at this point. Orion thought, frustration and anger simmering within him. But I won't throw my life away for the council's benefit. It's been, what? 2 or 3 days since the explosion. Silco will make his move soon, and they won't transport me while lockdown is in effect. Orion clutched the rough bedding, gritting his teeth. Jail or banishment or both. Damn it. Even if Orion healed himself now, he wouldn't have the energy to escape. The best he could hope for would be to break out and live as a fugitive. Helplessness and depression seeped in as he lay there for hours. Eventually, the sound of shuffling feet and a small commotion reached his ears from outside the cell. The jail cell opened, and he heard footsteps approaching. This is it, huh? I failed. Orion muttered, sighing as he closed his eyes. It was time to accept the future as a fugitive, forever on the run. An ominous tone crept into his ears, however, sending chills down his spine. It was low and taunting. I warned you, boy. But you never listen, do you? Chapter 45, Ambition and Power. / Early that morning in the abandoned factory / First time I've been invited to the lanes. It better be worth my time. Marcus sneered through his mask. While taking a stroll topside, Marcus had been approached by a stranger. The man offered him silver and an invitation to an abandoned factory along the river to discuss a partnership. It was related to securing the city against criminals and obtaining information regarding this disaster. Marcus's mind drifted to the chaos caused by just a few kids and the orders of the council. Grayson had refused to let him interrogate Orion, but he was ambitious. He respected her greatly but saw this as an opportunity to establish his own private connections. After all, Grayson had done the same. To Marcus, Grayson's connections in the Undercity were shady, to say the least. Creating his own also formed a disgusting pit in his stomach, but he was willing to take risks. Why would she care as long as it produced results? The council only cared about results and profits. Marcus wanted to be more as well, he didn't want to remain a mere enforcer. Silco stepped out from a dark entrance covered by eerie purple tendrils. You're looking for 4 little children running circles around Piltover's finest. What about it? Who are you? Marcus glared. The words stung, they felt true. You believe in results, don't you, Marcus? Silco smirked, pacing around him, the mention of his name causing Marcus to twitch. I can give you that. 4 children. The ones responsible for the explosion. And perhaps, a name your precious sheriff has kept hidden from you. Marcus's fists clenched. What do you want in return? A simple arrangement. Silco's crimson eye remained fixed on Marcus, unsettling him. My business thrives when Piltover's gaze is elsewhere. You, Marcus, will ensure that it remains that way. You want me to turn a blind eye? Marcus scoffs. No, Silco replied smoothly, stepping closer. I want you to do what you already do. Chase shadows. Make your arrests. Report to your council. But you will ensure that none of your men interfere with my operations in the lanes. Let me handle the Undercity. In exchange for some kids? Marcus asked, skepticism tinging his voice. And Vander, Silco adds. The hound he was once called when he led the rebellion years ago. We were friends once. A brief smirk crossed Silco's face as Marcus's expression betrayed his ambition, his excitement upon hearing this. Now he controls the Undercity and undermines your influence, preventing you from achieving the results you so desire. So you want to replace him? Marcus shook his head in disgust. And if I refuse? Silco shrugged, his voice dripping with mockery. Then you will continue to chase shadows as an enforcer while I build something far greater than anything you could imagine. After a pause, Marcus spoke, not bothering to hide his disgust and hostility. Fine. We'll do it your way. Marcus spat. Oh, there is one more thing, Silco said, trying to be innocent. The boy, Orion. Silco smirked as Marcus's expression hardened. He is useless to you, but not to me. Silco continued with fake benevolence. Do you want an innocent boy to rot in prison? Because of the failures of the council. Marcus removed his mask, a rare move for him, to spit on the ground. He didn't care about the boy but recognized this disgusting game being played. This conversation was revolting but ambition drove him, and the desire for success. He's already in custody and will be on trial later today. There's no way to get him out without it being noticed. Ah, but we know how easily arrangements can be made. Silco counters smoothly, pacing slowly around Marcus again. A bit of money, the right words, and perhaps a bit of persuasion? You stand as the perfect example, Marcus. Do what you want with him, Marcus spat. But if this backfires and the council catches wind of this? They won't. Silco waves his hand dismissively before extending it to Marcus. You'll have your results, Marcus. That's all that matters, right? Marcus reached out to shake his hand, Silco's firm grip felt mocking in itself as they locked gazes. Right, to good business. // Orion cell // I warned you, boy. But you never listen, do you? Silco's voice pierced the silence. Silco slowly entered wearing his iconic trench coat, his crimson eye glowing through the shadows. Orion's breath hitched. He struggled to turn his head, eyes widening as they locked onto Silco. What are you doing here? Silco ignored his question, a smirk creeping onto his face as he continued to taunt him. The moment you let the topsiders drag you into their world, you signed your death warrant. His gaze swept dramatically around the cell, his tone mockingly curious. I don't see Vander. Shouldn't he be here by now? His eyes returned to Orion, a trace of pity entering his voice. Did you believe he would come to save you over his kids? All of this is because of him. You're alone because of him. Orion's gaze faltered, the weight behind his words stinging more than he expected. Why do you care? Orion croaked, his voice barely audible. You wanted me gone after the cultivar. I am aware of Karina's betrayal and the choices you were forced to make for survival. Silco hissed with disdain. Taking a measured breath, he exhaled slowly. Orion, power belongs to those who will do whatever it takes. That's the lesson you are learning the hard way. Leaning closer, Silco locked his cold gaze onto Orion, his voice lowering. Gone? No. You're useful to me. And I can't let the Council destroy another soul that embodies the spirit of Zon. Survival. Adaptability. The desire for better. Before Orion could respond, Silco snapped his fingers and two bulky figures entered the cell. One carried a large, empty body bag slung over his shoulder. Pain shot through Orion's body as the henchman roughly grabbed him. I'm getting you out of here, boy, Silco said flatly, gesturing to his men. Not out of kindness. You owe me. And I always collect. You think I would follow you? Orion rasped, wincing through the pain. You don't have a choice, Silco replied coldly, stepping back into the shadows. It's just a question of whether you live long enough to make it matter.
Thanks for listening.